Hello, I'm Ibrahim Imam, and welcome to this episode of the Neurology Lounge podcast, in which we will continue our exploration of brain tumors. Today, I will be discussing the patient perspective of brain tumors with Christine Miskelly, who narrated her experience of witnessing how the disease manifested and progressed in her husband, Ivor. She also narrated her experience of caring for him. She published this in her book titled An Elephant in the Brain, 1 Year with a Brain Tumor, the carer story. And this was quite recent in 2022. Just a quick background, Christine did her first degree in psychology at the University of Durham back in the 1970s. And in more recent years, she studied consciousness and transpersonal psychology with the Aleph Trust. I'll probably ask you what that entails. But the bulk of her career was spent teaching psychology at A level. And she said supporting students through this period of their lives has been one of her great joys. Christine said she suspects that she has always been one of life's seekers with a constant desire to explore the big questions about ourselves and the nature of reality. And I think this came through in the book. And in times of emotional challenge, she finds writing therapeutic. So the publication of this small book was simply the culmination of this process. Christine Miskelly, thank you very much for accepting my invitation to participate in this podcast. I'm most grateful indeed.
It's a pleasure.
Why did you write the book? Kind of straightforward question.
Well, in a way, you sort of answered that in the introduction.
Yes.
When Ivor was diagnosed with this tumor, the whole thing it's such a shock, and life just changes. And I just found that keeping a kind of journal of things was helpful. It was helpful on a practical level, in terms of what doctors had said or what was happening. But somehow just the process of writing seemed to help me to work through things within myself. So I just kept this journal. And from time to time, I wrote poems. I don't often write poems, but it seemed to express in that medium felt good. And I was also in a Facebook group, which was helpful for brain tumour carers. So I kept records of some of the things there and some of the emails. And then, so after he died, there was this great collection. And I think there was a desire to somehow put it together. And I wanted it in a book on my shelf. I wanted it in a book on my shelf. And I also thought, well, there might be something here that would be of value to someone else going through a similar process. So, that was why I decided to self-publish it.
Okay. And as you were writing it along, did you find the writing helped you to process things?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, I'm not saying that will be the case for everybody, but it certainly was for me. There are occasions that, I had a look back recently at it and, up at 3:00 in the middle of the night and thinking and feeling that lost feeling and just coming and writing about it. Very, very helpful. Very helpful.
So going back to when Ivor's illness started, you said the first thing you noticed was definitely wrong was on your 40th wedding anniversary. And you said he spoke very little. I thought that was what men usually were like. Was he voluble? Was he usually talkative?
Well, it was. I mean, it was a wonderful day. It was a celebration of 40 years of marriage, and it was really, really great. But we knew that he knew he was going to speak, and I thought he'd prepared something. But then when he got up to speak, there was no paper there. There was the sense that it wasn't actually prepared. He just sort of thanked people for coming, and as the wife, I was sitting there thinking, when's he going to say how wonderful I am? And it didn't quite come, and it's fine. It was fine, and I didn't go away then thinking there was anything wrong. But as the months went by, it came September, October of that year. It's this withdrawal that gradually began, and it was only then that I began to sort of think back. Well, maybe he wasn't really able to plan what he wanted to say. And it was the beginning of the change, really.
Yeah. You put it beautifully, well, beautifully, not the right term. You said, as summer faded into September, Ivor too began to fade. What
Yes.
aspects, apart from you talked about the planning, what else kind of changed
I
in
think
personality?
the main change, I would say, was one of withdrawal.
Okay.
It's withdrawal in many, many ways.
Mm.
Almost a withdrawal from life in a sense. But he was always fairly quiet. He was a more reserved kind of person, but withdrawal into himself. He would just sit with the paper. He'd be very, very slow to get up in the morning, slow to get dressed, and a kind of withdrawal from me, in the sense that, yeah, and there was conversation, of course there was, but it just felt more distant, and he wouldn't always do the things that he'd said he was going to do, and that left me feeling a bit lonely. He's like the partner I'd had
Yes.
wasn't quite the partner anymore.
Good. Mm. Um, and then I don't know whether you said he also became self-centered, and in your book, selfish. Was that kind of an extension
Yeah.
of this withdrawal then?
Yes, it was. Because you remember at this time we hadn't. This is pre-diagnosis,
Mm.
so from my point of view, this is the man I'm married to. We're retired. We're about to share. We're sharing a retired life together, and suddenly he's becoming annoying.
Mm.
He's becoming annoying. He's not doing what he said he was going to do. He just wants to read. He doesn't really want to join in with me. I mean, he'd always had huge empathy, very empathic man.
Mm.
But there was a feeling that was going. And in fact, much later on, after the diagnosis of the brain tumour, I did say to him that I think one of the things this tumour has taken from you is your empathy. And he said, yes.
You had an insight into that.
Yes, he did, but much later on.
Yes.
But it was so. It wasn't characteristic of him. It was certainly a feature of the tumour. Mm.
I guess it's also an extension of that, the docility.
Yes,
He got angry. He didn't fight back. He didn't.
yes,
Yeah.
yes, yes. I mean, because I was trying to work out how to deal with this, how to wake this man up, how to
Yes.
bring him back into my life. And
Yeah.
at one point, I wrote him a letter. You know, I actually wrote him a letter to try and get this through.
Yes.
And at one point, got so angry, and he just took it, just took it. So yeah, very difficult,
Yeah.
very difficult.
I kind of took you to the edge.
Yeah.
You almost thought of leaving, didn't you?
Yeah, I mean, I'd never in my life had I thought we would separate, but there was a point at that point where I thought, I don't know if I can stay with this. What's happening to this man? Yeah.
And then this slowness, which manifested as well in the way he walked. He started lagging
Yes.
behind, and
Yes. Yes. I mean, I write in the book about the occasion in Italy. We went on a holiday in Italy,
yeah,
and we went to look at the catacombs in Naples, I think it was. And there was a tour going through. Come on, hurry up, hurry up! And he just couldn't hurry. And again, I was so frustrated. We want to catch them up. We want to catch them up. But he couldn't and wouldn't hurry. Another time, the rain was coming down. We were trying to get back to the car, and I was running to avoid the rain. And he would walk. And I thought, come on! But the slowness of gait, slowness of movement. Yeah.
and I was impressed with the way you broke that down, because it's kind of, as neurologists, we especially gait, it's a big thing for us. And you broke it down into its component parts, from his difficulty initiating actions and then
Yes.
easily distractible. How closely did you start looking at him at that time?
It's a difficult question to answer, that really. I suppose I suppose I did, and maybe, the psychologist in me, you do look at, perhaps you look at things in a slightly different way from someone who didn't have that background. But I did notice that these two elements, one is intention to action, so intending to do something and being able to carry it out. But then once he's doing it, being distracted, easily distracted onto something else. Yeah.
I can imagine. I can feel your frustration at the time.
Yes. Yes.
And then I just wondered, even though there was frustration, were there periods of banter or laughter? You describe him putting on his trousers and putting on his socks.
Not really, not really. I mean, looking back, you think that would have been a way of handling it if
Yeah.
we'd both laughed about it, but I don't actually have a recollection of us laughing about it.
No, no.
Yes, because again, in the holiday in Italy, which was just before he was diagnosed,
Yes.
the process of getting dressed was so laborious. You know, he would put one leg in a trouser and then stand, and then eventually put the other leg in, and putting shoes on, he would always have to brush the soles of his feet first, and I would stand there twiddling my thumbs, becoming more and more frustrated. But it just took, it was slow. It was slow.
And something which was, I mean, as a neurologist, we're kind of trying to find out what symptoms come with which disease and which part of the brain. And one that I struggle to understand is this increase in finger tapping and whistling. He started whistling.
Gosh.
He'd never whistled before.
No. I mean, he was able to whistle, but he did not whistle. He wasn't the kind of guy who would go around the house whistling while he was doing things. Not at all. But he developed this whistling of Postman Pat, from the children's TV program many years ago, Postman Pat. So he would whistle Postman Pat. And for me, it became almost sinister because I knew this was a sign of his illness. And tapping of, I mean, he'd often been a bit of a fiddler. He would twiddle the corner of his hanky. But yes, but the whistling was particularly strange. Don't know why.
I don't think there's any book that mentions it as a neurological symptom.
Oh, well, there we go. Yeah. Unique to my husband.
Yeah, well, kind of, it might be an opening. Maybe somebody listening to this podcast, doing a research might have an inkling.
Yes. Yeah.
And then it was later that he developed kind of what we would describe as a typical or worrying symptom, which is the headaches. He started carrying painkillers with him everywhere he went.
Yeah. I mean, the curious thing about this was, in a way, it wasn't new. When he was about 11, he'd been involved in a road accident. He'd been knocked over by a car on a zebra crossing with some quite serious leg injuries, but he'd also hit his head. And subsequent to that, he got migraines for quite some time. And when we first met back in the 1970s, he used to get migraines. So in a sense, headaches were not something that was strange to him. But over the years, these had declined, but then returned again. So, asking whether the headaches were the thing that triggered the need for a diagnosis, it wasn't really. It was more all these incidents of him getting stuck in the bath. Yeah, I mean, these were quite bizarre. The first instance of it really was, I'd been away for a weekend and he was due to come and collect me from the station. And I phoned during the day to say I was on my way and there was no answer. And then I phoned in the evening and there was no answer. And I became worried. I thought, well, why not? So a neighbour came round and had to climb into the house. And my son came round and he was there in the bath, but no water. And we had to get A&E out. And it appeared that he'd been there quite some time, and possibly 24 hours. And and he complained that he'd got back pain, but he knew he'd get out. And it was just very, very strange. But then on 2 other occasions, he'd been, I'm forgetting the order now, we'd been on holiday in Yorkshire, and he'd been in the bath and just wanted to stay in the bath and wash his hair, even though it was time to go. And similarly, on a holiday in Leipzig, we'd all been set to go out, but he said he had to have a bath first. So there was something about, and I would ask him what happened when he's in there, and he said, well, he'd zone out. He'd zone out. In his words, he would zone out. And he found something about sitting in the bath.
Yes.
He would just zone out and cut everything. I think cut the world out. Part of this becoming withdrawn as well, I think. But certainly that last instant, the one where we had to get the paramedics out, it was this must be wrong. There's something deeply wrong here. I mean, because I'd wondered about dementia and Alzheimer's, but it just didn't fit. It didn't fit with dementia and Alzheimer's at all.
And that's when he had the brain scan.
It was a friend of mine who's a practicing psychologist, and I was talking with her, and she said, do you think it could be a brain tumour? And I hadn't really thought about that, but when I went and looked, I thought, goodness me, yes. So at that point, after our holiday to Italy, we went to the GP, and it all happened very, very quickly then, very quickly. Yeah.
It was already 7 centimeters. Then it was in the frontal lobe, which would explain his behavioral symptoms, as you said.
Yes.
And you described how devastating it was to
learn that
this was. How much of a shock was it? How did it hit you?
Well, I think, there's 2 sides to it. In some ways, it gave an explanation. It gave an explanation. And once I'd got that explanation, there was no way I would have left him. Absolutely no way. And we became a team.
Okay.
We were a team. And we were going to work through this, whatever it brought. So in that sense, a diagnosis brought some clarity. But it's that shock, I think, of everything your life has been, everything you thought it was going to be is suddenly changed, and you're plunged into uncertainty. And it's that plunge into uncertainty which is frightening, for both the person who's got the illness and the carer.
And how much did he appreciate that this was a sinister lesion that was picked up on the scan at the time?
Well, yes, he did. He did. But unlike I go scooting off to find out about it and research and see. He was, whilst he wanted to know what needed to be known, he wasn't one for looking ahead. So I think in some ways he probably knew less than I did in terms of having researched or found out about it. But yes, it's a blow. It's a blow.
And it turned out to be a grade 3 or 4 astrocytoma. And he had, what treatments did he have?
Well, when we first went along after the scan, initially they said that they didn't think they could operate because of the dangers, to the rest of the brain. But so the plan was going to be, I think, radiotherapy, possibly chemo, to try and contain it from spreading. But then they changed. I'm not quite sure why, but the consultant thought that it was worth operating, that they could. And so that was the first. Well, they took the biopsy first. They had the biopsy first, and then we had surgery. So in the July, would it be July 2018, he had the surgery to remove the tumour, and we were told that they managed to remove about 80%. And in many ways, at the time, we perceived that as being successful, because by August, a month after the surgery, he seemed better. Okay. And we were able to go away a little bit. We were able to enjoy some time together. So that was quite an optimistic time. And then in the September, he was given radiotherapy. So he had the full course of radiotherapy, which took us through to October. And he seemed to cope well with that as well. But then by November, things began to deteriorate again. So we at some point we did discuss about chemotherapy, because again with the Facebook group there'd been conversations by people who'd had these therapies, some who were glad, some who were not, and we had talked about it, and he decided that he wasn't going to have chemotherapy even if it were offered. But in practice, the consultant said he wasn't strong enough to deal with it anyhow. So they felt it was. So we stopped after the radiotherapy.
Okay. And you talked about your varying responses to his diagnosis. I'm sure that's during this stage. You said at times wishing it will end quickly, and then at other times, with sadness witnessing his diminishment. How much of an emotional turmoil did you go through during this?
Oh, massive, massive, massive. Because it is this conflicting. Bring this to an end, please, because going through all this, seeing the decline, managing it, managing the uncertainty is so hard. It's so incredibly hard. You want it to end. But equally, you know that when it ends, this person you love will not be here anymore. And there's a guilt in that.
Yes.
There's a guilt in wishing it to end because you feel that you're wishing the end to your partner, and you're not. You're
Yes.
wanting an end to the situation. But it's very, very difficult. Yeah.
Yeah, it must be one of the most difficult things to go through. It's a bit of a internal, as a psychologist, probably had this internal conflict you had to deal with.
Yes, very much so. Very much so. Yeah. Yeah.
You mentioned that Ivor had an advance directive.
Yes.
Say a little more about this and how it was used.
Well, I'd come across it. One or two of my friends had sort of mentioned when that lady I knew had had one, and I think it was after he was diagnosed. We talked together about the potential value of having one. So we got a pro forma from somewhere. I think it might have been Dignity in Dying. We gained a pro forma and talked about it together, and he completed this. And we took it to the GP to sign. But the GP was a bit reluctant to sign it because he said it had been made whilst Ivor had a brain tumour, and it would be hard for him to ensure that this really he was in his full capacity. But he said, you keep it. So I kept it. But it was particularly useful on one occasion when he'd gone to hospital. He'd been very, very poorly in the January at home. And then, long story, but we had to go back into hospital, and they diagnosed an infection. And they wanted to keep him in the hospital to give him intravenous antibiotics. Now, I knew he wanted to be at home. And I wanted him at home. And we had a DNR and the advance directive, and I showed that in the hospital. And they said, well, okay, we could give oral antibiotics at home. But without that, I think they would have said that they would have to keep him in because the best interest of the patient would be the intravenous antibiotic. So, but I was pleased because he needed to be at home. That was we knew that's where he needed to be, and I was able to get him home.
Okay. Well, I think there are straightforward ways now to confirm capacity. I think it's just four questions, and so in the hospital they do it all the time now, even if some impairment actually determine whether they have capacity. And the capacity is for each decision. It doesn't have to be for everything. It has to be for
So possibly things have changed a little.
Yeah, I think it's a big thing now, trying to determine capacity. Can somebody make the decision or not?
Yeah.
And how did things progress in the terminal stages? How did it go?
Well, things. I mean, he had the surgery in July 2018, radiotherapy September, October. We managed to get away November a little bit, but then he had a first big seizure in November whilst we were away. And this was the beginning, really, of a downward spiral. So in the January of 2019, he was very, very poorly. We had a hospital bed at home. We had carers in. But then they increased his steroid dose, and it was amazing, really, because at one point we called him Lazarus because he got out of this hospital bed, and for a little while he was able to come back into his own bed, and it was really quite remarkable, you know. But this was the steroids, I think, that were helping. But in February, we went back for another scan, and it turned out that the tumour had now spread further. And we were told that really there was no more treatment that was appropriate, just to go and live the best life we could for as long as possible. But then I became unwell. I developed sciatica, a really very, very painful sciatica that was flooring me. And the Macmillan nurse said that I needed respite, which I fought against. I'm all right, but I acknowledged that I did. Yes. And very quickly we managed to find a very lovely care home that would take him in. Initially, this was going to be for a fortnight, just to give me a break. But in fact, he had further seizures and was declining, and he stayed in the care home. He kept thinking and hoping he was coming home, but there was no way I could look after him, and he needed round-the-clock care. And so he stayed in the care home, and that was from April until June when he died. But the care home were fantastic, and he was very contented there. The last stage is it took him about 10 days to die. It was a slow process, but very, very peaceful. He was on a syringe driver. He was very, very calm. He slept much of the time I was there, come and go. Until the last day when he died.
How did you cope with those in those final days? How did
well, I think I was quite good at looking after myself.
Okay.
And I think that matters. Everybody's different, but I didn't spend all day, every day at the care home. And I know some people would feel the need to do that. But I would go for 2 or 3 hours. I'd take my embroidery, things to do, things to read. I would sit and while he was alert, I would be there with him. But certainly the final days when he was asleep most of the time, I would go and then take myself home. Of course, there was a family and friends, friends, essential, essential. And then I would say my own spiritual life, which in a sense became even stronger or more important when you're faced with all this. So yeah, really very important for me.
You needed that to give you strength, I presume.
Yes, but and I think the strange thing with all this is that in all the awfulness of it, bizarrely enough, there are moments of deep beauty and deeply profound moments that you can't. Oh, I should feel emotional. That you can't actually describe. But they're there and they're deep, and they're to do with love. They're to do with love. The love that you shared, the love that people give to you. You're actually surrounded by love in many, and that is profoundly beautiful. And also a deep sense of purpose. There's no question, what are you here for? I'm here to be for you, the partner, whatever is needed. And that is profoundly meaningful as well. So it's not just about getting by, it's about what can open up in these desperate moments that you wouldn't think you could find a beauty in them, but you can.
It's interesting. So much life at the end of it.
Life and love. And I mean, it's all cyclical. You know, we're all going to die. We all have to face it for ourselves or others one way or another. Yeah.
I guess it helps to see that beauty even at that
yes
end.
To be open to it, to be open to it. And it's often there in the little things. I mean, the things that would make me cry then were the beautiful things, you know, the kind word, the person who pops around with a little plant or a cake, or they've made you something and you, oh gosh, thank you, you know, that is so lovely.
Did Ivor know he was going to die, and did you talk about it together?
He did. I think for some time there would be denial of that, in quite a healthy way, you know, the hope that things will improve, and, you know, the hope that the surgery and the treatments, we were told he could probably have another 10 years at one point. But then, you know, come the January, it became clear that he was really very poorly. And I did at one point broach the subject with him.
Yes.
And yeah, it was very, very difficult, very, very moving. So yes, he did know.
And how have you coped with the aftermath? Since he died.
Well, it's 5 years now, so that's quite a while. I mean, initially, I think there was a big relief. There's no doubt there was big relief that this was over, and in a sense, I was liberated from that. The funeral was wonderful. It was a glorious day. We had lots of friends and family around, and I was embraced. I was embraced by them, you know, in all ways then. So then I started, you know, changing things with the house a little bit. I went on a lovely holiday with a friend to a place I'd never been before. But then we had COVID, so everything changed then. But it, you know, it has been a process of learning to live a different kind of life, and that takes time. It doesn't happen overnight, and there are times when you feel liberated and it's great, and there are times when you feel lonely, and it's to be worked through.
Yeah. And do you think the book has helped you to fill a bit of that emptiness that is left?
I think the book, because I mean, although a lot of it was written whilst he was ill.
Yes.
After he died, it was some weeks or months after I thought about publishing it, and I actually sent the manuscript to a good friend to read, because I thought, well, would anybody want to read this, you know? And she said she thought that people would, but she suggested, she said, I think you should leave it at least a year after he's died before you do this, because you might want to take out some things, which I did. You know, there are some very personal things you think, I don't want everybody to read that. So it was a year later, you know, when I actually started trying to put it together for publication. And I think that process, yeah, I do think it was going through it. Every time you go through it, you just process it a little bit more. Yeah. So I think it did, yeah.
And you did say the reasons for writing was partly for yourself, and you hoped other people might benefit. What lessons do you think readers can take away from the book?
Well, I was thinking about that, and I was jotting some things down earlier. Lessons to take away. I think, yeah, on a practical level, you know, if you're a carer of somebody who's been diagnosed with a brain tumour, I would say to get as informed as you can, to be as informed as you can, so that you are in a position to make the wisest decisions. So, I think that's one thing. What else did I put? Yeah, learning to be present to today. I do think that is so much the key, because you can go into the past with regrets. I wish I'd done this, or we should have done that, or whatever.
Yeah.
You can go into the future and be very, very frightened about what you think might lie ahead.
Yes.
And so I think it really is, it's not to deny those, because I think you do need to think ahead. You do need to plan. And I would certainly, I used to think ahead to the time I'm in now. How will it be when I'm on my own? So there was a value in that, but really not to be carried down by the weight of the fear, because you can cope with a day. You can cope with a day. You can cope with an hour.
Yeah.
But when you carry the burden of what might be ahead. So I would say that one. What was the other one I put? Yes, everything is cyclical. You will emerge. You will emerge. It's the pattern of life, isn't it? That we go down and we come up. And so I think have hope.
Yeah.
That that even though there might be a deep, deep loss, that life goes on and there'll be new joys. So those would be my take-home messages, I think.
So overall, very positive messages actually from such a
Yes, but I mean, there's also self-compassion in there.
Mm.
There has to be self-compassion, because there are times when you feel totally in the dark. Yeah, totally in the dark, and it's frightening. It's frightening. But perhaps just to know that you can emerge out of the darkness,
Yes,
and that people do emerge out of the darkness, is comforting.
yeah.
Mm.
And perhaps my final question is, are there any other books you think listeners might learn from? Any suggestions?
Well, it depends on what line you want to go down. Your neurologist would want
Yeah,
sort
well,
of,
yeah. So anything to do maybe with brain tumors, the brain, or really life generally, because it's all about
yeah.
life, isn't it? Yeah.
Yeah, from my perspective, it's much more about the spiritual, and I mean that in the broadest sense of it, which is, how do we deal with this life? How do
Absolutely.
we live it? How do we live it?
Yes.
So I was kind of looking through, and I mean, this one, The Power of Now by Eckhart Tolle, I read 25 years ago for the first time, and it's down the years I've found it so helpful. It's this notion of being present to now.
Yes.
So if people have not come across Eckhart Tolle, that would be one. And another favourite writer of mine is an Irish, well, he was a priest, called John O'Donoghue.
Okay.
And he's dead now, but he was a poet, a philosopher, a priest, has written some wonderful stuff, really based on Celtic Christian spirituality. But this book, The Eternal Echoes, he has some wonderful chapters at the end on grief.
Okay.
And yeah, just wonderful writing. And both those people, there's masses of web stuff around, but yes, it's finding the opportunity in it to grow, really.
Thank you very much for those recommendations. Christine Miskelly, thank you very much again for participating in this episode of the Neurology Land podcast. I'm most grateful. And to my audience, thank you very much for watching or listening to the podcast. If you found it interesting, I suggest you get Christine's book and read it. And after that, you might want to touch my own book called Surfing the Brain. And for more academic things about brain tumors and neurology, I have a website called Neuro Checklist. You might want to check that out. And to make sure you don't miss the next episode of the Neurology Lounge podcast, you might want to subscribe to the YouTube, iTunes, or Spotify channels. Until the next episode of the podcast, however, thank you very much for joining me. And Christine, I'm very grateful for your time today. I've learned quite a lot.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Ibrahim.